Hello, and welcome to Season 2 of our show, Teaching with Creativity. I'm your host for today's show, Amanda Kulaba, Content Specialist at EducationCloset.com, your digital learning hub for arts integration and STEAM. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about the why and how of having students create self-portraits in your classrooms. Now, I'm going to share a few self-portrait lesson ideas, but I also want to share a few reasons why it's so great to have your students create self-portraits. Additionally, I'd like to give you a few ideas of what students can do with the self-portraits to integrate other content and learning. The reason I wanted to share these things about self-portraits is because I know teachers all over the world have students draw pictures of themselves all the time. A lot of times I see teachers using this as a first day of school activity or some other fluffy activity. My question though is, why should we use self-portraits in a fluffy way when there's so much potential for deep learning with them? So let me just be a little bit more structured. First, we're going to talk about why students should be creating self-portraits in our classrooms. Then we'll talk about a few different ways students can create self-portraits. And finally, we will talk about integrating some other content standards with the creation of self-portraits. So let's go ahead and talk about a few of the reasons why creating self-portraits is important for students. First, self-portraits are by nature introspective. If educators want their students to get to that point of self-efficacy or the point of having hope that they can change their circumstances if they choose to do so, then we have to teach them to be introspective. Now, artists often use self-portraits as a way of expressing various aspects of themselves and their identities beyond just the surface of their physical appearance. This really gets into the use of symbolism, and students can create a self-portrait using symbolism to communicate who they are as an individual. I love to think of this concept of visual symbolism and linking it to theme and main idea and details, and I'm going to show you an example of that in a moment. But when we talk about expressing your identity, if you're allowing students to do that, you're going to automatically have them engaged because they care about what they care about and they want to show it to the world. But another reason that students should create self-portraits is that the concept works for all ages. A kindergartner can create a self-portrait, and so can a senior in high school. Finally, self-portraits integrate well with other content. Like I said, they're not just fluffy. There are mathematical concepts to creating self-portraits as well as English language arts concepts, which will move us into the next part of this podcast. But let's just recap quickly. 4 reasons to use self-portraits in the classroom are: number 1, self-portraits are introspective. Number 2, self-portraits allow students to express their identities. Number 3, self-portraits work across all ages. And number 4, self-portraits integrate well with other content. Now, there's many other reasons to use them. I just isolated these 4 for this cast. Okay, I have gathered up a few self-portraits that I've used with students over the years. Now, I'm going to actually show these on the vodcast, but I'll also do my best to describe each so that you can visualize what I'm sharing, just in case you're listening to this as a podcast. However, I hope, or let me encourage you to come back to the vodcast and actually see the video later so you can see what I'm talking about. Most of these that I'm going to share are highly abstracted, and I like the idea of using abstracted self-portraits, especially with younger students, because they seem to always feel a lot of pressure when they're trying to create a realistic self-portrait, and abstraction takes away the pressure. So this is the first one, and this was made by, as you can tell, a very young student. It's modeled after Modigliani's work. We always look at some of Modigliani's portraits. They're all very similar, so we find the commonalities in those. Then the students model their own work after his, and some of the commonalities that we focus on are the long, skinny neck. So this portrait has a long, skinny neck. They have an angular nose, pursed lips, and blank eyes. Um, Students have to learn to blend colors to get the skin tone they want, and I teach them how to do that. But then they have to express their identity through the hair, through the skin color. Um, and I have a lot of students that want to make their hair different. Sometimes they want to make their hair actually resemble their hair, and then sometimes they want to, they'll say something like, when I grow up, I want to have pink hair. So they'll make their hair be pink, or they'll have it in a different hairstyle. Or, sometimes they will draw their clothes like what they want to be when they grow up. So it's just for young children, there's some ways that they can express things they like here. And this project really works great with black construction paper. And they draw on the black construction paper, and then they trace it with glue. So they just hold the glue bottle just like they would a pencil, and they trace around the lines they drew. And then they use crayons or chalk to add color once the glue has dried. Okay, this is another self-portrait that was done on a canvas. It has a newspaper background with a little girl holding some balloons, and there's a bird, and she's wearing a yellow dress. The students had to look through the newspaper and find something that interested them for this background, and then they just ripped it up and glued it on there. But this particular student found an article about the community theater, and so you can see from the remnants of that article and figure out from that as symbolism that that's something that the student cares about and really likes. So this idea of symbolism works really well here. She's holding balloons, which, if I remember correctly, symbolize her thoughts on being free. This was completed in 2012, but I remember her saying she likes the idea of releasing a balloon and it being free. The bird sort of has that same symbolic meaning, but the difference is that the bird kind of has free will, and it can choose where to go, or it can go where it needs to go to get its needs taken care of. But the balloons just they don't have free will. They have to go wherever the wind takes them. And so there's this sort of two sides of this concept of being free that she's trying to show here. And the yellow dress just represents her favorite color. And I remember her being very intentional about putting the bird on one side of her and the balloons on the other side, so that she could almost symbolize that sometimes she feels torn between the two things. Sometimes she feels like she is free to do whatever she wants to do with her life, and then sometimes she feels like she's just blowing in the wind and not able to make choices. So this is pretty deep. This was actually an older student that I taught at an art camp, and you could tell she's very gifted, and she gave me this canvas, and I've kept it all these years. But this is a great way to get symbolism into a self-portrait, and as you can tell, the figure is abstracted. It's a very simple figure of a child. So to recap, this was done on canvas with a newspaper background. They just ripped it up and glued it, and then it was painted with acrylic paint. And once it was dry, there was a sealer put over it, just like I think they just painted regular school glue on top of it to seal it down. All right, here's another one. This is actually the example that I made when I was trying to work out the process for how to use this with fifth graders. So this is a picture of me. But these are the exact same steps that I took as I was leading the students through this. So they took selfies, and we printed them in black and white. So that's a selfie of me. And then we painted a sort of bland, boring background with a sponge. So this piece of paper is just where we took a sponge and we took black and white and blue, and they dipped in the sponge and they just smeared it all around. Then after we printed the selfies, we cut ourselves out and glued that onto the background. And then here's where the fun part came in. We had to come up with a symbol that represented us. So I chose an artist palette because art is such a big part of my life. And I drew it, and then I added color with like markers, and I cut it out. And this was really, I glued it on top of my face because this was really challenging, because I wanted my eyes to show, because my eyes are one of my favorite features, or features that I like the best. So as I was working, I had to think about what I was drawing so that because I wanted my eyes to show. So that's pretty challenging to do. And I led the students through thinking about if they wanted their mouth to still show, or maybe their nose, or just their forehead, or however they wanted to work that. And this project was based on Magritte's Son of Man, which is the one with the man in the suit, and he has a green apple right in front of his face. So that was a self-portrait for him. And so I showed that, and we talked about it, and then we created this. And this shows the use of symbolism. Now the next two that I'm going to show you are highly abstracted. The students had to use colors, different colors, and I'm going to show these both kind of at the same time. They had to use colors and patterns that they are really drawn to or that they feel a connection to, and they had to use various materials such as yarn, and this white stuff right here is a mop that our custodians gave us, and they were able to cut, I mean it was clean, but they were able to cut the pieces of that for their hair if they wanted. There's duct tape, there's scrapbook paper, there's construction paper, they used crayons, they used markers, and on this one they used all kinds of paint and paint rollers and watercolors and crayons. And I'll show these last two to kind of get us to the next part of this podcast, or the final part of this podcast, which is about integration. So on the first three examples that I showed you, the one on the canvas, the one with the palette in front of my face, and the other one was the one with the long skinny neck, the Modigliani one. The symbolism was a bit more obvious on those, and I always use those, or I always like to use these to get students to write personal narratives. They've already got the symbolism built right into it. They just have to put it in words. So the symbolism in the last two is not quite as obvious, but these can be used to have students write just the same as the others. You know, they can write simile and metaphors on these. So this one has two eyes, and it has two eyes, but the lines on one of the eyes are parallel. And the student might write, "My eyes are train tracks in my hometown." This one has all kinds of color for the skin on the face for the skin, and the student might write, "My skin is like a rainbow, many colors coming together as one beautiful whole." So you see, you can really get some vivid language from this, and you can have them start to use those similes and metaphors to write a personal narrative. Let me go back to this one to talk about personal narrative. You could have the students go from this to using this symbolism in their writing to telling a story about something that they created one time, how they wanted to be an artist, because this is my self-portrait of me showing symbolism about how much I love art. So if you're doing symbolism and if you're really working on theme in class, you could have your students choose a theme. Like the theme for this could be artist, or that I love art. Choose a theme, use symbolism to represent that theme, and then write about it. And then they have to use those elements of symbolism and the main idea and the details to write that narrative. Okay, but there in math, like there's a ton of measurement students can do to create self-portraits. You could have them do any of these projects that I'm talking about on grid paper, and then they could find the area of their face. I love this abstracted one for measurement. They can measure the the lines across their eyes. They can measure the nose. They can measure, the lips. There's lots and lots of lines that they could measure, and then they could all combine their data that they collected from measuring the lines, and they could put it on a line plot, or they could put it in a circle graph and manipulate that data and analyze it and answer questions about it. The way I like to do this is to give them a problem to solve, and this just takes it up to a whole nother level. You give them a set of parameters, like the nose has to be between 6 and 8 inches long. So then they have to figure out how to make this nose between 6 and 8 inches long. And then they can actually measure it and get the data. But you gave them parameters, so they have to think a little harder when you set the measurements ahead of time. So, to recap, we have this Modigliani, the long skinny face, long skinny neck. They had to, they had to express themselves and use symbolism and things through the hair and the clothes. We had this self-portrait. It's a collage, and they painted on it. They had to find something in print that really spoke to them and use that for the background. And they had to come up with symbolism to paint into the picture of themselves. And they also, use their favorite color in that one. Color is a great thing to use for symbolism, especially with younger kids. This is the one where we looked at Magritte's Son of Man, and they had to take a selfie, and then they had to come up with one symbol that they could make really big, and then they had to figure out how they could draw it so that it would show their favorite facial feature. And here are these are the abstracted ones. You could, I just thought of this, you could have them measure the yarn for their hair. That would be good. That would be cool. Okay, so I hope you can see now that self-portraits can be so much more than fluff. I'm always here if you have questions, and I'm always happy to connect. I also love it when people reach out to share their own ideas or how they've used something in their classroom, or talked about what worked and what didn't work and how can we do it differently next time. I just love to connect. The digital world can feel pretty lonely at times, but it doesn't have to be lonely. Wink, wink. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone you think would benefit, and leave a comment below in the comments box. The best discussions and insights really do come from you. And I'll be checking in, so make sure you leave a comment. And remember, you deserve to thrive as an educator. You deserve it. Let your creativity shine. Let it shine through. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you next time on the Teaching with Creativity show.